Good morning. Welcome to the session on communication. Wildfire communication is of paramount importance to reduce risk, to enhance preparedness, and to support recovery. Thus, communication should be developed before, during, and after the outbreak of fires without different content, goals, and strategies. The two main topics discussed in these sessions are how to best communicate and how to measure the effectiveness of the communication strategies and practices. Our first speaker is Kathleen Stoff and Isabeau Ottolini. The stage is yours.
All right, and we're speaking through this microphone, right? Yes, okay, I'm moving this one. Good morning, everybody, and really nice to see you all. Today, this keynote is not just done by me, but I was asked by the organization to talk about wildfire communication, and I'm the creator and the scientific director of the Paralife Innovative Training Network, in which we train 15 PhD candidates in integrated fire management. And what we do is we bring the lessons of fire from the south of Europe to the north. We apply lessons from water management and other risks to fire, with a very strong link between science and practice and much attention for social diversity. And so, I do a lot of science communication about fires. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm also going to talk about fires in the Netherlands and Northwestern Europe. But if somebody asked me if I could give a keynote on communication, then I don't want to take the stage alone. So that's why because in our project, in our team, we have 15 PhD candidates and early stage researchers who focus on a wide variety of topics, including wildfire communication. So I invited with me on the stage Isabeau Ottolini, and how we're going to do it is I'm going to start in a broad sense talking about wildfire communication. I'm going to zoom in on challenges that we're having in Northwestern Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands, also talking a bit about tensions if you do develop the communication during crisis events instead of beforehand. And then Isabeau is going to take over to talk about a number of general lessons learned and best practices in terms of wildfire communication. And she'll also explain, hopefully, that why we're talking about wildfire communication and not about effective communication.
Exactly.
Exactly. All right, good. So there are a number of key changes occurring in the world and in the region at this moment. And what we're seeing, and what you all know, is we're seeing more and more extreme fires. We see fire seasons becoming longer, fire regimes shifting north, or actually shifting into more temperate areas where we think we haven't had fires before. And in 2022, we've seen fires across Europe, from the southeast to the west and to the north. We see fires basically breaking out in the wrong countries. So this is a photo from London last summer. And yeah, I mean, being Dutch, if I can put windmills and fire in my presentation, there you go. We have fires in the Netherlands as well, even though you might think of the Netherlands as a water country. And that's also one thing I'll talk about, is what we can learn from water in terms of wildfire communication. And there's a bit of a spoiler alert, because I don't think we can learn a lot from how the Dutch do their water communication in terms of fires. What we have in these countries that we're talking about in temperate Europe is we have a high population density, there's a very low awareness for wildfire risks, and preparedness is in the very early phases. Communication in this area is often still one way and based on narrow perspectives. And so what can we learn from Dutch water management in terms of communicating about fires? Well, in terms of managing fires, there's a lot that we can learn from Dutch water management. And In the bottom right, you see a beautiful visual that's part of a paper by Hugo Lambrechts, who's in this room as well. Living with water and living with fire. There's basically 3 main topics that living with fire can learn from living with water. It's a holistic approach, a long-term holistic approach, adaptive management, and resilient landscapes and stakeholder participation. But if you look at communication, and I work a lot with Dr. Jasper de Vries, who's a social scientist working with communication. I asked Jasper, like, okay, what can we learn in fire? What can we learn from water? And he shared with me that he said, Carolina, the government framing of floods is very much, we've got you covered, you're safe with us. So there's very little focus in the Dutch government outreach in terms of what to do in case of floods. And if you look at what is out there, it mostly focuses on get your insurance and what to do in case of evacuation. So the screenshots on the bottom left is the website called overstroomik.nl, which is doiflood.nl. You can enter your postcode and your house number, and it tells you how high the water will get and what you need to do. So, in addition, Dutch people look a lot at the government to reduce risks, even more than in the European South. So we have an example from a very wealthy community in the west of the country, in the dunes, where there's a group of residents who wants a water company that manages the dunes to do landscape management. At the same time, they have thatched roofs, so roofs made of reed, and they don't manage their home ignition zone. But they say, the government, you need to do something. When you compare fire and floods, in flood risk reduction in the Netherlands is mostly a government action. So it relies a lot on dikes and mounds. It's a lot of landscape engineering, and that is shifting. But in terms of fire, if you want to reduce fire risk, then it requires a lot more individual change than what you need in terms of flood management in the Netherlands. So, and this individual change has to do with ignition management, but also with fuel management. When you then look at good communication, you really need to know how the system works. And in floods, we know it, we can model it, we know a lot about how these floods work. In wildfires, in many countries we do, but in a lot of countries we don't. We don't understand the basic drivers of fire. So in Northwest Europe, much of the awareness is we have no fires, and fires is something we have in the south of Europe, in warm countries. Fire causes are usually unknown, with very little fire cause investigation being done. Fire danger is poorly understood. Everybody knows the Canadian Fire Weather Index, but the FWI index is not a good predictor for fires in our part of the world. It's really more the fine fuel moisture code that works. In terms of fire behavior, we have urban fire services lacking a solid or standing at the start, basically, of developing a better understanding of wildland fire behavior and management. And in terms of fire impact, home ignition zone management is not being done. There's no action taken on that. We have no policy. And then when you zoom out in terms of more broader countries, we also have extreme fires occurring for which the drivers, the processes, and the forecasting are very challenging and often also impossible. So in terms of communication, the effect of that is that decisions are often taken during events instead of in advance, based on assumptions and causing tensions. So some examples of tensions is first an example from the Deurne Peel fire in the Netherlands in 2020. In terms of crisis communication, the residents felt there was a lot of fear and anger and distrust towards the Forest Service, towards the government. There was the situation where evacuation notices were distributed. They were distributed by printed letter, and they were handed to the people in the highest risk part last instead of first. Then There was also no contact point. This was a peatland fire, and the fire burned for 2 months. So there were a lot of reignitions after the main flaming phase occurred. And the residents saw smoke, and they needed to have somebody to talk to. It needed to be community fire management, and that was not the case. Another example is tensions between fire service and land management about whether or not to communicate fire danger. So the fire service wants to communicate fire danger. There's a hesitancy amongst land management because of a fear for fire setters. What is interesting is that I dove into the Dutch literature, into the historic literature, and you see some beautiful examples of this squirrel that says, "Watch out with fire." There was a case with a banner in the forest. There was a lot of what they called propaganda in terms of fire education, and during periods of high fire danger in the past, it was the Forest Service who was communicating on radio, on TV, in the cinemas, that there was a high fire danger. Another example is between the fire service and biodiversity. Last summer, we did not have the major events that the United Kingdom had, but what we did have was very similar fire weather. And then in advance of that fire weather, there was a lot of stress in the fire service because they saw it coming and they were concerned about roadsides. And then basically they requested stakeholders and landowners to mow roadsides during the very high fire danger. And of course, if you do that, that was often one-way communication in the heat of the moment and without consideration of context, history, and existing dynamics. And that is a challenge. I've done a lot of science, and I do a lot of science communication in terms of fire, and I've been doing it for 15 years. And I've tried to push policy, I've tried to push for action, for change, and for better preparedness in the Netherlands, mostly through my science and through science communication. I realize now that you can get only so far. Ultimately, right now what we do is it's a really a joint effort. But in the science communication, we basically went from we have fires in the Netherlands, which is a message that is still new to people, to we are not prepared, to saying, I'm afraid we need to see people killed before changes are made. Do we need a disaster before changes are made? I must say that if you say that on the 8 o'clock news and they use that as a teaser, it's pretty scary because I started saying that internally first and then to stakeholders, then to the media, but then they cut it out because they framed it as all these other countries in the south are having a fire mess and we're being awesome in the Netherlands. To actually now they do put that on TV. I didn't make this change in policy, but what it did help is that, together with a number of other people, it helped push for urgency, indirectly via the fire service, because recently the fire service appointed a woman called Hester Veldman, and she is now lobbying in The Hague, where her parliament is seated, and there's a lot of change being made, and it's now high on the political agenda. Because of that, we now have a Dutch national crisis plan, or we're developing a Dutch national crisis plan. The province of Noord-Brabant, or actually Safety Region Noord-Brabant, where we have a few people in the audience, is working on risk communication. And in our project, we're also working on risk awareness through a serious game with residents and policymakers. And so now I'd like to hand it to Isabeau to talk about the international lessons. While we take this one.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I appreciate you sharing the stage with me. So yes, I'll share a few of the insights from my PhD research. And actually, there's an upcoming PowerLife report also about this, so anyone interested, feel free to reach out to me. So communicating about wildfire, it's a challenge, and I suppose that's why we're all here, to learn from each other how we can improve. And through the research, what I've seen is that I've had the chance to talk with a lot of wildfire communication experts, And it's become clear that it's rather easy to fall into the trap of communicating about wildfires in ways that are rather counterproductive, in the sense that experts that decide what communities have to know and do, communicating in very one-directional and top-down manners, and using messages that are simplified and focused largely only on the risk dimension of fire. And so this quote, I think, is quite illustrative in the sense that when we do wildfire risk communication, often we have the impression that we've communicated, right? We've told people how to act in case there is a wildfire, how to prevent wildfire, how to prepare. But have these messages actually landed? And more importantly, do people know what they can do? Are they empowered to do something, to act upon it? So, yeah, there are 3 points that I think are interesting to highlight. First of all, what I mentioned, that experts, they decide often what citizens need to know and do. And this approach, it's very much informed by the idea that communities are passive receptors of information that have to be nudged into desirable behaviors related to risk reduction. So, for instance, we could think that, well, our communities, they have to create defensible space. But if you're talking to people who can barely make ends meet, no matter how well-intended your messages are, how effective communicating strategies you're using, they'll probably not follow these recommendations not because they don't want to, but because they can't. Basically, you're just adding one more thing on their plate, and it doesn't connect with their lived experiences, their needs. And that's why we propose that citizens and experts deciding together, collaborating together. This morning there was a lot of talk about the importance of collaboration, and this is also with communities very important. And for this we can try to reconceptualize communities as active agents of change who can make an equally valuable contribution as experts. It's different, but it's valuable. And like Lara Steele mentioned this morning, the dialogue of knowledge. And so what we can do is start with identifying the community's needs, their interests, their knowledge, and using that as a starting point, instead of experts being the starting point in communicating. And so there are a few other recommendations which, the importance of listening, building trust, open and respectful dialogue, and moving away from this mentality that experts always know best to what can we learn from interacting with citizens, and how can we, with our expert knowledge, our skills, our networks, our resources, how can we support communities? Next is moving away from top-down one-directional communication towards more multi-directional communication. And this also implies supporting and facilitating all these formal and informal networks that exist, because those are the spaces where a lot of social learning happens. And, not just about the risk dimension of wildfires, but all the emotions, the lived experiences, the stories, the local knowledge, which is super important. And in fact, all of us, we are a part of all sorts of communities, of networks, and wildfire communication doesn't only have to happen in informal channels and spaces. It can also be in our day-to-day interactions with friends and family, and the people at the bakery. And also, it's like this multi-directional communication. It's also great for, as mentioned, sharing these emotions, validating lived experiences, to mitigate all the tensions and conflicts around wildfires and its management, and identify what the community actually needs from you as an expert. And then thirdly, to move away from these simplified risk-focused messages towards acknowledging that wildfires are multifaceted and very complex processes. What do I mean with this? Wildfires, essentially, you have the flames and the smoke, but they are on itself a visible manifestation of the slow disaster unfolding and resulting from decades of complex socio-environmental processes that can go from fuel buildup, climate change, the increase in wildland-urban interface, but also colonialism and neoliberalism. And that ties a bit up with what one of the speakers this morning also talked about, the root causes of wildfire. So yeah, some further recommendations is to dare to dive into the complexity, the messiness of wildfires, because people, they do know and they do understand and they're curious, and so why not feed that curiosity? Also acknowledge, as mentioned, that wildfires are the top of the iceberg. It's what we see, but there's so much other things going on, and this is a work we can do with communities and exploring in the different places around the world, what are the root issues and how can we work on those? For instance, in my case study community, sure, there have been 2 very big wildfires in the last 7 years, but the wildfires is not really the issue for them. The issue for them is rural depopulation. It's scarce participatory democracy. It's the individualization of society. Those are the things that have to be worked upon, and that ties together with wildfire, or the reduction of large and destructive wildfires. And lastly, like, get creative, together with communities, co-create stories, poems, artworks, whatever. It's great to see that during this conference there is the cultural program, and there's also, maybe for the storytellers in this room, there's an annual storytelling microgrant from the American Wildfire Experience, and the applications has just opened, so any people who like storytelling, I encourage you to apply. So yeah, these are just some reflections to communicate in wildfires in a way that's more locally situated, it's more socially just, and to really cope with the unprecedented socio-environmental challenges we're facing. So the floor back to Katelijne.
Thank you. So if we want people to be able to do these things, the question is the current education that we offer in schools and universities, is that sufficient? Is that the right type of education that we need for wildfire communication in its broadest sense, or actually for integrated fire management? I have a personal opinion about that. I personally think our schools and universities are too much focused on disciplinary teaching and very little on interdisciplinary teaching or transdisciplinary, so little it's between disciplines and between science and practice. And that is one of the ideas behind PyroLife, the innovative training network in which we're training 15 PhD candidates in integrated fire management. PyroLife is built on 4 axes of diversity. We do inter- and transdisciplinary research, linking countries, risks, people, and sectors, academia and practice. So in terms of training, what we do in PyroLife is all the PhD candidates and early stage researchers have their own specific research, but they receive broad training that is, everybody receives training in social aspects of fire, in biophysical aspects of fire, in policy aspects. It's about engaging with stakeholders in society. And some of the activities and trainings that we've done is on risk communication and writing policy and management briefs. You can do that with PhD education, but not everybody does a PhD, fortunately, because if everybody would do a PhD, then the world would be very narrowly focused. So we don't just need to do this at PhD level, but also at master's level, bachelor's level, and actually in all kinds of schools, not just in universities. And so a spin-off of PyroLife is Pyrogeography, a master course that I created at Wageningen University, where I work. What we do in Pyrogeography, it's about integrated fire management, and in the capstone project, what we do is we work with an artist, and we work with stakeholders. The groups of students are matched with the stakeholder, they work on a challenge together, and the only assignment that they have is put the challenge of the stakeholder in the context of what you learn about integrated fire management and produce anything that's not an essay or a PowerPoint. And these are some examples that the students made, including a year-round fire calendar in collaboration with the Forest-Wise team here in Portugal. So our take-home message is that fire is changing and it requires individual action and more than in floods. We need to understand what's going on in order to have good wildfire communication, and that is also in emerging fire regions. In the Netherlands, I talked about the challenges we have with communication, but ultimately leading to fire now being on the political agenda. And Isabeau shared about wildfire communication, the essence of citizens and experts collaborating side by side through multidirectional communication and acknowledging wildfires as a multifaceted, complex process, stressing the benefits of a holistic and human-centered approach that goes way beyond merely just wildfires. And this has implications for training and education. And I end with two pitches, because this evening at 6:15, we have an interactive workshop in which we discuss what kind of training and education is needed in schools and universities to train people better for integrated fire management. And then also, we have a range of very well-trained early-stage researchers entering the job market in a few months or a year. So actually, some of them are sitting right there and also giving presentations. So raise your hands. There you go. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen and Isabeau. Next speaker is Kay Lintunen. Please, the stage is yours.
Can you hear me? Excellent. Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kai Lintunen. I'm the leader of the UNEC FAO Forest Communicators Network. I'll say a couple of words about that later. And I work for the Finnish Forest Association, which is the cooperation organization for the forest sector in Finland. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I will share a few thoughts on communicating and on communicating on wildfires. It is in no way exhaustive, and some things I can only echo that was said in the previous presentation, and some things might be familiar for you already from before. So let's see. First of all, media coverage on forests is predominantly negative. It focuses on deforestation and illegal logging of forest fires, and there are aggressive social media campaigns against cutting down trees. Many of us here know that wildfires here, play a valuable role in ecosystems, and in many places are unfortunately more or less unstoppable. So how do we bring messages to an already overwhelmed public about fire prevention and fire management and the role of fires in ecosystems and the complexity of fires? Well, let's start off with this gentleman. He made international headlines when he blurbed out things on Finland that were really surprising for us Finns as well. Taking into consideration how dramatic and how complex and the effects of fires may be, both to human lives and the environment, it's remarkable how simplified he saw the dynamics. And of course, people were quick on their feet, and social media in Finland caught on very quickly on raking the forests. And in true Finnish fashion, it perhaps went a bit over the top. Immediately, various hashtags were abound, and they were actively used in social media. However, this proved to be a very good opportunity for us to promote the Finnish way of doing things, forest fire related, and not to ridicule Trump. We have a wealth of expertise here from Finland, and I'm not going to steal their thunder on what the features and what kind of system we have in place. But I gave, and many others gave interviews left and right to media interested in this issue, and they were, very many of them were fishing for us to have a stab at Trump. But we rather use the moment to providing constructive information on what we do and why we do it. Effective communication takes the higher ground, and it never misses a good crisis. And so, I talked to some folks about this audience in advance, and I know very well that many of you are very savvy in communication in your own expert fields, so I don't want to bore you too much with what I'm going to say. Effective communication helps to create a clear, accurate, concise, and courteous message that is more likely to be received and understood correctly by the audience. It means exchanging information and ideas and thoughts and feelings in a way that is clear and concise and well received by the intended audience. And we need to be coherent and make sense to the audience. Effective communication involves both the sender and the receiver of the message. It requires that the message is accurately conveyed, understood, and interpreted by the receiver as intended by the sender. So be confident and communicate with assurance and conviction in order to build trust, because that's what it's all about, building trust. It requires several skills, including active listening, clear and concise language, non-verbal communication, empathy, and adapting to different communication styles and contexts. So communicate specific, tangible information rather than generalities or abstract concepts as much as you might love them. This helps the audience to understand and remember the message more efficiently. The sender needs to be aware of the communication styles of the audience, as already pointed out earlier, and they can then adjust their approach accordingly in order to be clear. Be accurate and appropriate in the language and information you convey to come across as reliable. This is essential for building and maintaining relationships, achieving goals, and at best, resolving conflicts. Based on this, we locked 50 communicators to a room and only let them out once they came up with these principles that could be adaptable to your daily work as well. So let's go through them. Political will of this is of the essence. If you don't have the support from the top, you won't succeed. You need the people who hold the budgets and make the decisions to understand the importance of communication and how it can contribute to their core functions. And then we need the right people with the right skills and the right knowledge. If they're not there, we need to find them or train them. Like all other activities, communication comes at a price, at a cost, and it needs to be a part of the budget. Many organizations include an automatic percentage for communication in their projects already. And then to fail to plan is a plan to fail. Successful communication needs to be planned and sustained. Everybody involved needs to know what the messages are and what we need to achieve. Communication is done for a purpose. Every good communication strategy starts with a set of clear aims and objectives, so we're specific about what we want to achieve. And then, base your objectives and tactics on the best available facts, knowledge, and data available for you, and use credible sources. Who do you need to communicate with? What do they do or think now? What would you like or want them to think or do? And how can you reach them? And I can't emphasize enough the forming of partnerships, pool your resources, define common messages, capitalize on each partner's strength. And great communication needs to get and hold people's attention in a unique and innovative way. So use surprise tactics even to challenge. And as you know, with these kind of questions and themes to fire, big changes will not happen overnight, so don't give up, but keep at it. So let's move back even closer to the fire again. I can only echo what was said in the last presentation. It's in essence important to meet people where they are, both physically and mentally. Find out where people are and go to them with people they trust and in the language that they speak, in order to build trust and increase the likelihood of successful engagement and behavior change. So, and of course, different communities, they have different needs, different situations, different preferences. And communication and engagement need to be tailored accordingly. So it's not top-down. A couple of words on the Forest Communicators Networks. Together, the FAO networks now have more than 500 enthusiastic members, mostly professionals from governments or other forest sector organizations and other organizations around the world. Their work has resulted in remarkable initiatives and positive messages about forests in broad cooperation both inside the forest sector and outside, to an increasing extent. It is a global network with a single goal: to communicate the value of forests to people in all regions of the world. The European one is almost 30 years old, and since 2018 there are 6 networks in 5 continents, in 5 regions, and we're currently in the work phase of establishing one to North America. So we'll know more about that at the end of the year. We carried out a small sensing exercise to see what communications are out there, what kind of activities are there around the world. This is not scientific by any means, and I understand there later on in the conference there'll be a more profound comparison on activities presented, so let's regard this as a starter. So we carried out a look on what has been done around wildfire communications, and here's a selection of some powerful examples. Let's start with the King of Forest himself. I believe Smokey is the longest running public service announcement campaign in the US at least. But first, there was Bambi. Disney loaned Bambi to the US Forest Service for 1 year in 1943. But then, in 1944, the first Smokey Bear campaign poster appeared. And the punchy philosophy and slogan was, "Only you." Only you can prevent forest fires. And there was a lot of finger pointing. It was made clear where the responsibility lies, addressing forest dwellers and visitors alike. Then in 1982, Bambi made a brief comeback to show that the only you philosophy has staying power. Overall, for more than 75 years, Smokey Bear has protected the forest and promoted wildfire prevention. And his powerful message, "Only you can prevent wildfires," is at the heart of America's longest running PSA campaign. Smokey's message remains relevant today, as nearly 9 out of 10 wildfires nationwide and further are caused by humans and can be prevented. And additionally, of course, to add to the complexity in these unprecedented times, time outdoors has never felt more valuable. Others adopted the "only you" philosophy, like this South African Boki, who looks very intimidating. and it's made on and off appearances, so it really holds your attention. Japan was very pointedly clear with this cigarette imagery. Found that clever. And this philosophy is applicable both south and north. Also Scotland embraced the idea. And to broaden the theme, in Argentina, it was let's be responsible. It's a common effort. In Peru, the forest authorities and fire authorities joined forces, and I think the slogan translates roughly to avoiding forest fires is in our hands. And we found several education and awareness campaigns using children to convey the message in the Mediterranean and Middle East region. Here the approach is very directly about avoiding making mistakes. There's some powerful imagery on humans and devastation of nature and its effects on people. I find it clever, it speaks on many levels. There are some private sector initiatives as well. Again, you're responsible and engaging youth and kids in Indonesia. Then there are some very local practical applications like hands-on stuff. In the US, the National Fire Danger Rating System is science-based and uses information like temperature, humidity, and wind to let firefighters know how wildfire will behave. And signs like these are all over the Western US, mostly in rural communities, helping people know fire danger. But what is on the sign is only as good as the humans that need to go out there and change it. It's a great tool, but very analog. Whole programs exist to deliver information to communities in the wild-urban interface and beyond. And of course, involving communities, as was said, is a crucial element of communication, something you are much more experts than I am. There are some examples on this from Indonesia, from the government side, then all the way to local communities. It's our future. We're bringing about change. Then another private sector example from April engaging local communities in a 3-stage program. And then one dimension is example of accommodating livelihoods where fire is part of the production process. And that can be, of course, very challenging. And it's important to reach out to the city dwellers who often have lost their roots with nature, but often suffer from problems such as haze caused by these massive fires. In Indonesia and Malaysia, this one used public crowdfunding as a resource. The Global Environment Center is working with project partners, local communities who are patrolling peatland areas near reserve forests to detect and extinguish fires before they get out of hand. And they work together with the Forestry Department and the Fire and Rescue Department. And then, of course, some of the renowned NGOs have pitched in as well. Here's one in Thailand. The general public plays a key role. There's some very punchy and catchy wording. Inhale and learn, exhale and act. And this involves a roadshow, which is taking it to where people are, as I pointed out before. So, strategic approaches may take many forms, and policymaker and partnership focus, like here in the US. So what else? All in all, to sum up, here are some things we found and some things we did not. There's a lot of shifting responsibility to individuals, as we saw. And involving communities is a must. Raising awareness with urban citizens who live far but suffer the consequences. Then education, not only for kids, but for kids as well. And there is some strategic backing on initiatives, but then what is not there so much is exactly the underlying drivers and causes of forest fires that we need to address. And perhaps more communication on this is needed. And then, of course, there's the daring question of what the role of media should be and how we should engage with them. As we know, these questions have many dimensions, and they're pretty tricky and complex. So you're in a better position to assess and address the role of these key factors that are affecting your communication in your respective environments. Socioeconomic and sociocultural factors, the on-the-ground circumstances play a crucial role, as do societal planning systems, and you need to think with whom do you need to talk and where and how. So, to sum up, communicating prevention versus risk. In many parts of the world, the focus is on prevention, maybe not enough, because risk is complicated for small communities and it awakes strong emotions. And prevention on paper sounds pretty straightforward to grasp. So you're aware of these, I'm sure, and as I saw, but to crystallize some thoughts from the previous two. Work with governments, but with local leaders and the communities. And before the blaze, prepare, build systems. And of course, multi-leadership and multi-stakeholder approach. They need to be there in a respectful way and engage in the communities, the local leaders, and finding out how the system works on the local level. Then these campaigns take a long time, and it is a slow thing, and it is complex and it has many dimensions, but when it works, it can be very effective. So meet people where they are with messaging they can understand. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So in the next 10 minutes, we are going to hear Sarah and Nestor. I ask you to highlight some points in this communication complex issue. The previous speakers approach using different scales, so it shows that the problem is complex and requires different kind of strategy and tactics. So what you would like to add to the previous information?
There was a lot of really good information there, so it's hard to pick out anything to highlight. But you actually stole one of my main points, which is meet people where they are. In the fire world, we get really focused on we need to get people to do this for fire and because of what we care about. Whereas if you meet people where they are and you listen and you find out what they care about, you're more likely to actually get the behavior change you're looking for, because there is no reason people should care about fire as much as we do. That's our job, it's our passion. But they might be willing to do exactly the same thing, but for something different. And so if we meet people where we're more likely to recognize that the diversity of motivations and needs of why people behave. The other thing is I often see us default to this idea of sort of fear-based messaging, of drama-based messaging. The big house is on fire, and it's devastating, it's catastrophic, it's mega fires. And that's actually not, I think, a very good way to motivate people. And the research actually shows that what people care a lot more about is the ecological benefits of fire. And so we have sort of lost that in a lot of our messaging. We focus on risk. Like I thought the point about we need to move away from this risk-based messaging is a really good one, because risk is only one motivation for people, and it's not, in my opinion, the dominant reason people act on things. But in focusing on risk, we've gotten very focused on the negative side of things. And in the end, focusing on beneficial reasons for an action is actually going to get more people to do something. We adopt things more readily when it's a positive. And this is going to improve my life, not this might stop me from my life getting worse. We adopt things because they make it better. So I think there would be a real benefit to focusing on the beneficial in our messaging a lot more than just, and I want to get away from messaging, because messaging always feels like it's one way. And that makes me, I always get nervous about that, because in the end, it is very much Isabeau's point about it's interactive, it's listening, it's hearing what people care about. That's how you will find out where they are coming from. And I think, I will stop there with one final point, which is Smokey is wonderful, and his message is really good. I'm a huge defender of him in the US. The fire community tends to like to want to throw him out the window because they blame him for everything. And he's done a really good job with his message, which is be responsible when you're in the woods. And that's a message we still want people to follow. We still want them to not put out fires. But his message has worked because we're asking for a very simple behavior from people. Don't start a fire, right? What we're asking for people now is a much more complex message. It's a message about a range of behavior changes, how to live on your landscape, how to build your home, how to plan for if there is a fire. So it's much more complex, and that will require a much more complex communication effort than a simple messaging, one-way sort of bear or animal. The final point is Smokey's incredibly benign. If you want to see what existed prior to Smokey, just Google Death Rides the Forest. Death Rides the Forest. It's a pretty spectacular skeleton riding through the forest with sort of setting it on fire. It's spectacular, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Nestor, please.
On that uplifting note, I think, of course, there's so much to kind of latch on from what you all said. I think there seems to be a very specific theme running through this panel. It doesn't surprise me, which is sort of communication is not throwing risk information at people. They're not the same activity when you kind of throw risk information at people than when you're trying to communicate about the risk. And then I think the point that you were raising, Sarah, is absolutely spot on, which is, what do we want when we communicate about the risk? We want to take a different approach to the behaviors that are kind of creating risky activities, but also we want to bring citizens and stakeholders. It could be not just citizens, because I think we have been focusing on talking to citizens, but forestry is a huge commercial activity. And a lot of it is about communicating to those who benefit economically from the exploitation of forests. And we need to figure out how to involve those people in the messaging just as much as we are thinking about involving community citizens in these messages. Because ultimately, unless we bring them along with us in this journey of changing behaviors and thinking differently about how we act responsibly about our forest exploitation, the way we engage with forests, and the way we engage with wildfire risk, it's not going to change. Because I think part of the work I do includes looking at sort of how countries have tried to learn and sometimes failed to learn lessons from previous incidents. And it's quite surprising how many inquests, inquiries, parliamentary commissions, and what have you, find that communication is lacking, or there's a problem with the communication, not just the communication prior to the event, but also communication during the event. So in instances where we had some dramatic human losses as a result of forest fires. One of the aspects that gets picked up as part of these inquiries, looking into what happened, how was it that we were there and lost these lives, is, well, we failed in different levels on how to communicate with the community that we were trying to communicate during the fire. And I think that is something that we shouldn't forget, that this is, sometimes we will have circumstances where we have to communicate and we have not done the groundwork. And we have to understand what are the things that work under those circumstances, just as much as we need to understand what are the things that work under circumstances where we have time to prepare, where we can bring the community with us, because we will have to deal with these two circumstances. And I think the last thing to say is, I know that you mentioned that perhaps there's little we can learn from the way we communicate about water, and I know you were sort of provoking a little as well. And I think sometimes we are all guilty of speaking to our own community, and I think there's something absolutely fantastic when it comes to groupthink, which is when you talk to people that believe in the same things that you believe in and that have the same opinion as you do, the communication feels uplifting, engaging, rewarding, and you're really, really excited about the outcomes of that communication exercise. When you talk to people that do not share your values, that do not share your beliefs, that do not agree with you, the communication feels really hard. It's not a pleasant activity. It really takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of emotional energy to engage with that. Communicating with people that share your beliefs and are on the same page as you is not where we have to be. We have to engage in these difficult conversations with people that do not agree with us. And we need to create the common space to, even with people that do not agree with us, share a minimum common approach to the kind of behaviors that collectively we need to take. I think that's probably my time.
Thank you. I would like to put a question to all of you before move to the questions proposed by the audience. The first question is, you show how complex is the problem of communication. You identify some strategies to move on. What are the methodologies to measure the impacts of communication? Okay, so it is necessary to clarify your approach to communication and the scale you are considering. But could you give some examples of how to measure? Because political institutions and responsible to implement communication programs need to assess the impact, the effectiveness of the strategies and tactics adopted. What are your messages to the institutions that are responsible to design, to implement communication programs?
Isabel?
Please, feel free.
Yes, maybe I can share a bit that, of course, with communication, first question is how much is measurable and how much are you missing out when you try to quantify things. I can just talk from my own research, which is with the community, and a lot of the communication within the community, it's totally informal. It's in the day-to-day interactions, the whole social learning process. At this point, I don't know how to measure that. And actually, I would love to know how to measure these very intangible things. So if anyone has ideas on that, I would love to hear that. Yeah, so I just want to point out that. But
yeah, I tend to agree. There's not a magic formula on that, but of course, then there are many dimensions that you can measure your media coverage and social media coverage, but one of the things is in advance to go about with as robust communication systems as you have and create protocols and templates and define the roles and use proper documentation. So you got as much data and statistics to your availability as possible. And then, but I wouldn't know 100% system for that either. But the world is full of assessment tools that are available. But then, of course, it depends on the dimensions and the situation.
Thank you.
I think as much as it's super hard to measure the effectiveness of your communication, it's even harder when you don't think about that when you start designing your strategy for communication. So think about where you're going to get measures from when you're designing the strategy. I think that's really important. With, for instance, social media, there's ways, depending on how you feel the message, to actually measure interaction with the message. But unless you factor that into the way you're designing the campaign, it's going to be very hard to reverse engineer those metrics and those ways of measuring interactions with your message post-event. So bear that in mind at the start. I think the other thing that would be useful to understand is, of course, this comes with all sorts of caveats, but there are sort of tools to understand how to gather qualitative information. So one of the things that has worked very well for some countries, particularly during the COVID experience, granted this is not wildfire communication, this is sort of pandemic risk communication, but I think similar applies. We've had countries engaging in messaging with local voices and using local voices to amplify messages. And these same local voices that amplify messages can also gather anecdotal, perhaps, information about sort of how the message is being received by the communities, and having a way of collating that back and building a sense of how the message is being received is another way of measuring. It's not quantitative measuring, it's qualitative measuring, but if you structure it, you can still get really good insights out of it.
Thank you.
Maybe one thing that I don't know how you would measure it, but I mean, we see a lot of tensions in communities nowadays and a lot of distrust. And I'm thinking of the Dernse Peel fire example, where there was a lot of distrust and anger and fear in the community. In fact, in a way, we use the word communication now all the time, but I mean, what I learned from Isabeau and our other early stage research is that we have to talk more about engagement. It's about engaging with the people. And that is kind of sort of prevention in a way. So it's also something that is absolutely essential. You need to do it ahead of time. It takes time to build relationships, to build trust. And I think that if you don't do that, you will see that in after events as a lack of trust, so distrust. You see negative interactions or fear or less acceptance of the community, from the community, of what institutions are doing. And that is maybe also something, it's this everlasting challenge of how do you tackle things proactively rather than reactively. And communication is one of those things that if you do it well, you might not even notice that it's all the time being done, integrated with the community. And it's mostly the cases where it's not going well that pop up. And with that distrust, especially in an age where there's a lot of fake news and where there's a lot of popularization, not just popularization, but like the major political challenges where also scientific information is not accepted, that can all feed into that. So in that part, wildfire is also, it exposes the challenges that are in the community before the fire, and those come out after there's a fire. And those are not tensions because of the fire, they're tensions that the fire exposes, but they were always there. So that's why it's so essential to engage locally to see, okay, what are the networks, what are the relationships, what is the community interested in, to tie into that, to really work with the community.
And I think there's also when we're engaging in communication, and particularly in crisis communication, and we want to see specific behaviors, so if we want to see people evacuate within a specific time frame, we shouldn't shy away from actually pairing up the metrics from how well our evacuation is going on with the metrics on our communication, because it is a direct metric for how well our communication effort is going. If we want to see a specific behavior, measure that behavior and see really how much of that behavior is taking place, particularly when it becomes time-sensitive and life-saving behaviors.
But that's tricky. How do you correlate or get the causality there that the behavior you're seeing is due to your communication?
I think that's a really good question.
I mean, that's kind of the whole challenge with
I
the
think
measurement
that's
thing.
true with anything to do with prevention. How do you sort of
Mitigation,
make
yeah.
sure that sort of prevention or mitigation, anything that adds to a kind of cumulative effort that maybe is difficult to measure. But there are certain things that you can see. Sort of, is there, and this is perhaps the easiest example with evacuation. If you see sort of people self-evacuating sort of after they become aware of a certain threat approaching at a kind of higher rate than before they became aware through your communications, then you can assume some causality, but you cannot prove. So it's kind of how to challenge those things.
Well, we could have a whole discussion about evacuation communication, but
Yes, I see.
I won't go down there. I will just throw out the one point about that I've run into that managers seem to like is the idea that, in building sort of what Catalina was saying, is almost to me the best measurement of effective communication is if something goes wrong, you don't actually have people very upset. In other words, they don't protest, they don't yell, because they understand what happened and you've done a good job of communicating, so you've built those relationships. And so one measurement I've given to managers that they're like, oh, I could do that. I'm like, how many complaints do you get? And to me, successful communication is you're not getting any complaints.
So how do you measure causality there?
True? Nope. I know. Causality is always hard with all the social stuff because we're so complicated.
Yeah.
Let's answer some of the questions of the audience. One is related with how to communicate low probability extreme wildfires, but because they have a low frequency, but represent a high threat to people, how to communicate these low probability extreme events. Do you have an idea? Yes, Kay, please.
Listen.
Yes, please.
Maybe it is a good way to start is to try and make it tangible somehow, to focus like on a specific event or its potential impact, and then try and provide broader context on similar events and data and statistics from before, and to emphasize the preparedness and how to prepare for that, and not to alarm or raise panic or something, but to how do you go about your business in making sure that the impact can be mitigated or avoided, and then there's a certain element of uncertainty there, and you have to address that and try and make it tangible and inform on so it has a real connection to the, even if it's low probability, there is a probability there somewhere, and kind of humbly go and build it from what you have to make it relevant for the audience that you're trying to reach.
Yes, so people need to understand well what this kind of norms they are, what kind of characteristics they can present in order to prevent and to prepare for this kind of events.
But it's also about, it gets to sort of my point earlier about like our tendency to want to go for the drama. Like, there's plenty of fires that are not extreme, right? And that's a different response than an extreme. So, but we focus on the low probability but high catastrophic event. And there are some things like earthquakes where that's often the case. But with fire, you have a spectrum. So to me, it's more about helping people understand the spectrum. That if there is a fire, there's conditions, and in more extreme conditions, you might want to have different behavior. And rather than having this uniform, fire is always bad and you need to run away with it, because then you run into some potential problems when you do have an extreme event. People might decide, like, oh, I already know what this event's like. I don't need to behave this way. So to me, it's about contextualizing the different types of fire and the different types of behavior that people might need. And to make a point without sort of turning it into every single fire is going to be life-threatening inherently, to say there are some fires when your behavior might want to do it differently. And I think Australia has been trying to get at this a little bit with their fire danger rating when they added in the, what is it, the catastrophic, or the catastrophic, which says, you know, on most days you might be able to stay and defend, but on today, go. And they're sort of highlighting that this is the low probability extreme event, but they're not separating it out as this is all of them.
I think there's a tool that I've seen used by some countries, and I've used myself when I was working back in the British government. And I think they call it backcasting. And it's a different way of engaging with a scenario of a low probability, high impact event. Instead of being in the present and imagining a future that is grim and that is kind of very impactful, but we're not quite sure even that we understand the probability well enough. If you place yourself in the future and imagine this event had happened already, and tell yourself a story that you managed very well, then explore what was it that made you be able to manage that event really well, and start unpicking what are the things that need to take you to that future where you want to be. And that effective engagement in a positive future is really, really powerful, not just for working with policymakers and decision makers, but it also helps with engaging at a community level as well.
What I would add to that is, when you said backcasting, I was thinking about history, because in terms of extreme events, I mean, people often look at how often we have those events right now. For the case of the Netherlands, there's a perception that we had never had fire. But if you look into historical literature, even in the 72 years of fire statistics reports that we had from 1922 to 1994, when we decided fire was not an issue anymore, when you look at that, it's like 1929 was a massive fire year. 1959 was also a massive fire year. We had a really bad fire in 1970, and I found in the photo archives a photo of children in shorts, school children in shorts using birch branches to beat out the fire. So at that time, there was a fire culture. People knew how to stop fires or manage fires with hand tools, and then technology took over. It's just that we don't know those things anymore. We had a big fire disaster in 1917 with 18 fatalities, but it happened in a place that was not the center of Amsterdam, but it was in a rural place that was very poor, and it was a peatland reclamation area. We called them peatland colonies. And so it's also about keeping the memory alive. It's about looking back to see, have we had events? So I fully agree with what Sarah says. We need to communicate. We need to talk about the entire fire spectrum. But if it is about these fire disasters and the low probability events, it's so much worth it to look back in history. It's like, when have we had this before? And then you can even do the backcasting again. What was done then in order to work with the community or individual people to prepare for that?
There's a fantastic set of examples of precisely this with tsunami risk. And people kind of trying to gather social history for places that have been affected by tsunamis in the past, to try and get testimonies from the people that have been affected by the tsunamis and still remember what happened and still remember what they did and what was required to do. And I think if we were able to perhaps latch onto that kind of rich social history of our experiences of fires and sort of not discount the kind of the lived experiences of the people that are still around with us I think that would be really, really powerful.
The experience is crucial to initiate preparedness. And you talk about the experience that pass across generation that is effective. It is not necessary to spend money to keep it ongoing, but effectively when that experience does not exist, it's necessary to create that experience, because otherwise we cannot start preparedness. But one of the questions here is that maybe one of the reasons of so difficult to develop communication could be a barrier, the existence of a barrier between social science and natural science. And as there is this division, so the communication process is not effective. So what do you have? What do you want to say? It's necessary. Effectively, exist a barrier between social science and natural science, and it is because of that communications programs are not so representative in wildfire management and are not so effective, or it's not really an issue. The problem is beyond that.
I think it's related, but I think it gets to one of the points that Kai made earlier, is that social science can provide a lot of information, but we don't actually use it well. And one of the points that Kai made was we actually don't train people in good communication skills, right? And there is actually science that can inform communication skills, but what we tend to do is expect the people who are fire managers to just go out and talk to people. And that doesn't necessarily, they may or may not be good at it. Some of them are phenomenal, some of them not so much, right? Whereas if we made a bigger effort to more systematically, so we systematically take physical science and apply it when we train managers. We don't systematically take social science and apply it when we train managers and other people in terms of how to interact with the public, how to communicate, and all of those skills. And so in that sense, I think there is room for better use.
Okay.
Not between the different fields of science, but I feel that I would be careful not to make, when you work with the media, let's work with the media, not make it an adversary, and because it's true that very often in science, be the science whatever, the media writes a story that they're supposed to write with a human interest, and houses burn, and not to simplify, but then they very often they need credibility for the story, and they need to corroborate things with scientists or experts that are credible. So that's where science has a golden opportunity there to come up, and that's where you need to train the scientists as well to come up with an entry point. Be that with artificial intelligence we were able to shorten this or that, or be that as silly as the Trump example was, that there's an entry point in there with all this silliness, but you're in there with your messages and discussions, and first and second of all, not all media are alike. Some do more human interest stories, but then there are these which I've understood little by little that the National Geographics and the different kinds of media are slightly turning towards the more kind of pragmatic and profound, and understanding the driving forces and that kind of a thing. So I would go into the media in an analytical way as well, and not just bunch them that they're just a group of something that we need them.
Yes, of course. Yes.
I think we've been sort of walking around one of the issues, which is the mis and disinformation context that we find ourselves in when it comes to risk communication, or when it comes to wildfire communication in general. And I think one of the strongest elements of kind of markers of when mis and disinformation takes hold in a community that you're trying to communicate with is numeracy skills. And I think like trying to understand sort of what is the context that you're communicating in, what is the level of numeracy of your community, how susceptible they are to sort of actually being communicated in a kind of science-based way or sort of in a different way, I think is really important. And I think you all mentioned as well, value-based communication. If you make sure that you understand what is it that makes someone tick and you use that to communicate, rather than what you want to communicate. We might want to communicate about the science because we're very excited about all the good research that we've done, but maybe that's not what makes people tick. So find what makes them tick and communicate using that.
Thank you. Well, I would like to ask you, in 1 minute, if you want to leave a key message for the audience, considering the different aspects that have been discussed here, and it's clear that 1 hour and a half is very short time to discuss a topic of extreme interest in wildfire management. So it's a suggestion that in a next event about wildfire communication, in order to explore better the multiple dimensions of the problem and different strategies that can be used. But would you like to give a final message, each of you? I don't know. Maybe Nestor, do you want to start this time?
Okay,
Just a short message.
I'll pinch the strapline from one of your campaigns that I sort of modified slightly. One of the campaigns that you mentioned. And I think it's inhale and learn, but then exhale and share. I think we need to make sure that we are learning from what we're doing, but also we're learning from what others are doing and not doing, and sharing those lessons, I think.
And I'll borrow from Nestor, find out what makes them tick.
And, well, the fires are not going away with the changing climate, so I would just like to encourage all of us to persevere and keep at it and don't give up, because it is multidimensional and difficult, but we're on a good curve here, and just keep at it.
Mm-hmm. Isabel?
Yeah, maybe what I would like to highlight is that one of the things we're talking about often is how to make communication efficient, based on this idea that, okay, people have to know how to manage or prevent wildfire risk, but maybe we should walk a bit away from this idea of efficiency and rather see how can we communicate in ways that actually help like the general socio-environmental resilience, not just focus on wildfire risk, but a much broader perspective.
And then tagging onto Isabeau, it would be about training and education. How do you train people to do this, to go forward?
Well, thank you very much. I ask you to join me in a thank you to the speakers.